Thank you all to the organizers and for their hospitality, for the invitation to come here. And let me just begin with the caveat that this is sort of my first pass at this material. It's new material. And yes, my instinct is to always go with the most controversial thing I can think of. So here we go. The original title on the fascist Jew, Imagining Nazis in Soviet Print Culture. In July of 1933, 5 months after the appointment of Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany, the Soviet Yiddish journal Der Apocalypse published a blistering attack lambasting social groups that purportedly colluded to bring fascism to power. Written by the polemicist F. Sprach, the essay opened by laying out the dominant Soviet interpretation of fascism articulated by the Comintern in 1928. Fascism, Sprach argued, constituted a form of counter-revolutionary dictatorship grounded in demagogic anti-Semitism, a partial attack on usurious capital, and a fierce hatred for parliamentary pleudermill, or claptrap. Fundamentally, he stressed, fascism constituted a political form generated by capitalism in crisis, unable to extract itself from the protracted crisis of the Great Depression and threatened by the rising tide of revolutionary communism. The global bourgeoisie embraced fascism and united behind itself the petty bourgeoisie and the D-class proletariat to defend its class interests in power, to destroy the communist strata of the proletariat, and above all, to eradicate the center of global revolution, the Rattenverband, or Soviet Union. As a politics of class power, Sprach maintained, the Hitlerist revolution won the, quote, trust and hope of the bourgeoisie of all peoples in all lands. Now, writing in Der Apocalypse, the Yiddish journal organ of the Moscow-based League of the Militant Atheists, Sprach unsurprisingly focused his analysis on the appeal of fascism among one particular folk, the Jews. Drawing upon evidence from the transnational Jewish press, Haaretz in Palestine, the Yiddische Zeitung in Munich, the Warsaw Orthodox Religious Der Moment, and the, quote, Menschewik Bundesbintelbrief of New York, the Der Vorwärts, Sprach leveled a damning critique of purported Jewish quiescence in the face of Hitlerist revolution. Despite rhetorical alarm about Nazi anti-Semitism, as well as what Haaretz described as the, quote, small pogroms made by some hooligans among the Hitlerists, the Jewish bourgeois ideologists, he claimed, expressed tacit and at times jubilant support for the Hitler regime as an anti-communist bulwark. Haaretz, for example, celebrated the fact that when faced with two extremes, Hitlerism and communism, the German people, quote, chose Hitlerism. An editorial in Der Moment justified the acceptance of the Nazis on the grounds that they allowed religious practice as opposed to, quote, Marxism, which sought to destroy belief. Across the public sphere, he asserted, Jewish voices whitewashed Hitler's bestial, inquisitorial anti-Semitism, assured readers that Hitlerism would tame itself once in power, and rejected protest and boycotts on the grounds that, despite misgivings, in the words of the German Rabbinical Union, our, quote, religion teaches us to serve the state truly. Driven by inescapable class interests, Sprach argued, the global Jewish bourgeoisie accepted Hitlerism, however begrudgingly, as the preferable alternative to anti-capitalist revolution and Bolshevism. Sprach's polemics constituted one salvo in the massive offensive against fascism in the Soviet and transnational Yiddish press that escalated throughout the 1930s. In this paper, I'll focus on one of the most controversial aspects of this campaign, the central place of the image of the Jew as co-conspirator within visual and rhetorical depictions of fascism. Most obviously, these depictions brought into question the political reliability of Jews in the face of the existential threat of fascism. More provocatively, I'm going to argue that these discourses also exhibited the tendency, analyzed by Eric Weitz, for Soviet conceptions of nationality to, quote, slide from nationality to race. Representations of the Jew as a fascist co-conspirator reveal deep ambivalences concerning the possibility of Jewish assimilation due to inherent ethnic and increasingly racial difference. As these images migrated, particularly from the Yiddish press to the Russian press, political non-belonging slid into a discourse of ethnic and ultimately racial non-belonging. So let me begin by laying out the evidence gleaned from the several sources that I'm using today. First, Apocalypse, in which Sprach's article appeared, and in which this image, which I'll talk about in a second, also appeared. Second, the short-lived Belarusian Der Kriegische Apocalypse, the organ of the militant atheists in Minsk. And finally, the Russian satirical journal Krokodil. So the first image you see before you is a 1931 image that's captioned Der Bund zwischen Rav, Faschist and Capitalist, the union between rabbi, fascist, and capitalist, and it prefigures Sprach's thesis, published 2 years later. The image depicts at the top the uniformed, rather interchangeable fascist leader, flanked to his right by the portly capitalist and to his left by the equally portly rabbi, all raising champagne glasses and bound together by the swastika. The swastika serves as a weapon for the political repression of the representative workers crushed under the weight of this ruling troika. The unsubtle message, and warning subtlety is not on display here today, depicts the ultimate bourgeois aim of fascism, to suppress proletarian revolution. Aside from the beard and the slightly elongated nose of the rabbi, who sports a gold chain across his protruding belly, the capitalist and the rabbi are virtual mirrors, suggesting class affinity. The bourgeois and his ideologist are barely distinguishable. Both could in fact be Jews. While this union of capital and clericalism constituted one recurring trope of Yiddish anti-fascist imagery, other variations focused upon deviant counter-revolutionary and anti-Soviet politics. Take, for example, this anti-Trotskyist image, which appeared in Der Apocalypse in February of 1932. Here, in a trope to which I'll return later, we have the happy bride and groom, Adolf Hitler and the Jew Leon Trotsky, marching off to marital bliss. At their head, Karl Kautsky, the leading German social democrat and father of the bride, presumably, leads the way, shouting, "De Mezinke ausgegeben, de Mezinke ausgegeben." The little whore is married off. Marital union here asserts alliance between Hitlerism and the outcast Trotsky, whose whoredom derives from political promiscuity. Trotsky, Menshevik turned Bolshevik turned anti-Soviet traitor, has now, quote, given himself to Hitlerism through his relentless barrage of anti-Stalinist missives from exile. He's led down the path by the fallen, decrepit Kautsky, whose vehement anti-Bolshevism made him a primary target of Stalinist attacks against social democrats as, quote, social fascists and supposed bedfellows of Nazism. Here in image 3, or the third image, from August 1932, Der Apocalypse, in another variation of the same old unholy union, we have the Jewish bourgeois in the middle who marches in lockstep with the militant bourgeois social fascist to his left and the vaguely Hitleresque Nazi to his right, all under the banner of intervention, meaning military intervention against the Soviet Union. A third ubiquitous theme of anti-fascist propaganda in the Jewish idiom explicitly attacked Zionists as supplicants to and agents of fascism. And this image is from the Apocalypse, December 1933. Here, the tuxedoed Zionist maintains his bourgeois form and sartorial choice, and the image, I would argue, is vaguely evocative of Chaim Weizmann, as he places the Magen David, the Star of David, on the chest of the proud Nazi, dubbed in the caption an Erdzionist, an honorary Zionist, suggesting affinity between the two ideologies. The image appeared in 1933, immediately following the 18th World Zionist Congress in Prague, which had affirmed the Havara transfer agreement, the agreement negotiated between the Zionist Federation of Germany and Nazi leaders to allow for the transfer of German Jews to Palestine. Implicitly, the image excoriates Zionist leaders, most notably Nahum Sokolov and Zev Jabotinsky, for their willingness to negotiate with Mussolini and Hitler for the sake of extracting European Jewry from the claws of fascist Europe. The supposed supplication of Zionists before fascist power blended seamlessly into a more damning critique that Zionism was in and of itself fascism. This, an argument which became standard fare throughout the global communist Yiddish public sphere. This 1935 image appeared in the Minsk journal Der Kriegische Apocalypse, it was this image that actually started me thinking about this project, because it was rather striking and still remains, I think, the most problematic of the images that I'll show you. But though short-lived, the Kriegische Apocalypse dwarfed its Moscow cousin in the sharpness of its attack. Here, under the title Der Faschistische Magen David, the fascist Star of David, direct equivalence of the movements is asserted. The swastika envelops a range of Zionist actors: religious Jews, supplicant Zionists offering up tanks, bombs, and poison, and the Zionist settler manning the machine gun. The image appeared alongside an array of articles attacking the Zionist movement for a litany of supposed crimes, including charges that it served the interests of British imperialism through the colonization of Palestine, embraced fascist racial policies through the insistence on excluding Arab labor in the Yishuv, and sought to achieve power through militarism and domination. The sharpness of this attack was superseded only by the more radical, although quite rare, I actually found one example, assertion in the Yiddish press that the fascist spirit dominated not only Zionism, but the very source of Judaism itself, the Jewish god Yehovah. This image evokes the Cyclops Yehovah, which had been preferred throughout the 1920s by Soviet anti-religious artists, in particular Dmitry Moore, as examined by Robert Weinberg. What we have here, if you look closely, the Jewish god, it says that it's subtitled, "The Jewish God did not stand apart from the Catholic one in his crusades," referring to supposed the anti-communist crusade by this religious alliance in fascist Poland. Yet here, Yahweh wears his Nazi heart on his swastika lapel. If you look closely, he's wearing the swastika along with a number of his religious symbols. Taken as a whole, the anti-fascist campaign in the Yiddish press fused together virtually every discourse about Jewish non-reliability that percolated in disaggregated form throughout the 1920s. Here, again, from the Kriegische Epikoros in 1935, disparate enemies, including the Jewish Bund, aka the Jewish social fascists, the Zionist Nahum Sokolov, and the Hasidic Yiddish publisher Hillel Zeitlin, fused together in the image of a pack of dogs unleashed by the Nazi capitalist against the Soviet Union. Tellingly, the enemies of the system take non-human form, revealing their inner bestial nature. Such representations of fascists as animalistic non-humans remained a distinctly secondary theme in the Yiddish press. For the most part, Jewish fascists remained humans, if portly or obsequious ones. Religious proclivities, adherence to distinctly Jewish politics, and animosity towards the Rotten Farban made these Jews enemies. Politics, not essence, transformed some Jews into enemies. Following the classical definition by Max Weber, we might designate that what is at issue here was a distinct ethnic identity, with ethnicity being understood as a subjectively embraced form of identity grounded in culture. Insofar as culture was acquired, it could also be overcome. And indeed, in the pages of the Epikoros, such images appeared alongside a different common trope, which affirmed the possibility of Jews overcoming acquired cultural beliefs and practices. So I'll just give you two examples. This image from 1933 depicts generational conflict over the proper naming of a Jewish newborn. On the right of the little mamzer in question, the old ethnic, which is to say culturally bounded Jews, insist upon the archaic Yankel. On the left, of course, the young Jewish pioneers demand an acceptable alternative, Karl, as in Marx. By rejecting the cultural baggage of the older generation, young Jews become not simply de-ethnicized, but quite tellingly in this image, deracialized. They're visually indistinguishable from any other young pioneers from across the Soviet lands, right down to their button noses. Likewise, in this image, the very practice of pig farming itself on the kolkhoz allows Jews to transcend ethnicity. The archaic Jews at the bottom remained, however, bound by Torah, trade, and shmatas, and the shtetl. Again, proper politics and practices erase the stigma of ethnos. And here I'll just add that there's a research paper waiting to be written on in the new burgeoning field of animal studies on the Sovietizing pig as agent of Soviet history. But here, the pig brings Sovietization. A far different logic of identity emerges, however, when we turn from the Yiddish to the Russian press at the height of the Great Terror in the 1930s. Due to time, I'm focusing mainly on examples from the satirical journal Krokodil, in which images of Zionists and rabbis remained almost completely absent throughout the 1930s. Rather, renderings in the anti-fascist campaign focused on one particular manifestation of the Jewish fascist, that of Trotsky and his alleged co-conspirators. Jumped ahead, okay. Anti-fascist and anti-Nazi imagery was a recurring theme in Krokodil in the early 1930s, but the early depictions, like this one in 1932, rendering the future Führer, focused on the bestiality and violence of the Nazis themselves. Although here, I'll just point out that the gorilla is being led along by an unnamed social democrat, evoking the social fascist line, and it's the worker who says, "Who's that behind your back?" Right? Yet with the onset of the Great Terror and the launching of the Moscow show trials in 1936, visual representation shifted radically back to accused Nazi co-conspirators, focusing recurrently, but not exclusively, on Jewish Bolsheviks Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, Grigory Sokolnikov, Karl Radek, and above all, Trotsky himself. Crocodile, it heralded the opening of the first show trial in August 1936 with an image by Konstantin Rotov that asserted the a priori guilt of the leading co-conspirators, Trotsky in exile, Zinoviev and Kamenev, pictured at the bottom. Armed with pistols and bombs, the swastika triumvirate form one point of a union of capitalists and jackbooted Nazis, poison gas-wielding soldiers, and bomb-throwing fascist thugs backed by old regime military men. A similar image by the Jewish artist Yuli Ganf, coinciding with the second trial of the Trotsky-Zinoviev Center in January of 1937, depicted the leading defendants, Yuri Pyatukov, Karl Radek, Grigory Sokolnikov, under the image of Trotsky. Their collective anti-Soviet crimes are visually asserted to outweigh those of the massive enemies in the other cup that includes, among others, Mussolini, Nazis generally, General Franco, and the Civil War generals Denikin and Wrangel. Despite the clear assertion of the conspiratorial guilt of the accused, both images that I've just shown you nevertheless depicted fully human enemies whose criminality again derived from the political choice, presumably, to conspire treacherously with fascism. As the trial unfolded, however, depictions increasingly asserted the fundamentally non-human, bestial, and demonic nature of leading conspirators in general, and Trotsky in particular. One image, for example, again by Ganf, from the 1936 trial, depicted Trotsky as a snake among snakes, beguiled by the Ouverture dla Gadov, the overture for reptiles, of the Nazi Pied Piper. The Jewish artist Boris Efimov, by contrast, turned to pigs in 1938 to symbolize the descent of Trotsky and his co-conspirators into the ranks of the non-human enemy. In the hands of Jewish artists, most notably Efimov, dehumanizing images of Nazi co-conspirators routinely stressed the debased nature of all conspirators, Jewish and otherwise, as equal in their vile inhumanity. So here we have Trotsky along with Bukharin and others. In this infamous image, probably his most infamous image and most famous also, Trotsky forms one head of a Nazi hydra, along with the non-Jewish Bolsheviks, Bukharin, Alexei Rykov, and others, being crushed by Yezhov's iron gauntlet. In renderings by non-Jewish artists, however, particularly those of the Kukranitsky collective, depictions of Nazi co-conspiracy focused increasingly on the singularity of Trotsky. This depiction, coinciding with the second trial in 1937, presented a Nazi carried into intervention by an impish gaggle of co-conspirators, Karl Radek, Yuri Pyatukov, Grigory Sokolnikov, and Mikhail Tomsky, who had committed suicide in 1936 rather than face an assured guilty verdict. Trotsky appears as a demonic Nazi lapdog, singularly different even among enemies. Even when rendered in human form, and this is the last image that I'll show you by the Kuklinski, depictions of Trotsky stressed singular, demonic, and essential difference. In this image, the final, entitled Gigienia Ubitsi, the hygiene of murderers, the demonized Trotsky hangs his towel on the swastika to wash his hands in blood, collected in a spiked pickelhaube. There is, of course, nothing overtly Jewish about Trotsky as depicted here, other than the hint of blood libel. Yet the images assert Trotsky's inherent and unassimilable difference. The alleged demonism of the politics of Trotskyism become indistinguishable from Trotsky's own alleged demonic nature. One cannot tell if the politics produces the essence or the essence the politics. Politics and nature fused inseparably. So in conclusion, depictions of enemies in Crocodile evoke an unmistakable slide, I would argue. As enemies devolved into animalistic snakes, dogs, pigs, and simple murderers. Unlike the Yiddish press, which foregrounded the fascistic politics of culturally bound Jews, yet left open the possibility for integration by those following correct practices, depictions of Jewish enemies in Crocodile exhibited increasingly deeper ambivalence. Jewish cultural and religious practices disappeared entirely, as I said. After all, the specific Jewish enemies depicted here had long ago tossed off vestiges of supposedly archaic Jewish culture and ethnicity to embrace outwardly Soviet power. In it rhetorically explaining how such self-consciously de-ethnicized Jews could slide towards fascism, renderings increasingly turn to depictions suggesting that deviation inhered in their very nature. No amount of pig farming could rehabilitate such individuals into the ranks of fully human Soviet citizens. In doing so, explanations of Jewish deviation shifted from a discourse structured by the concept of acquired culture or ethnicity to one that invoked tropes of ascribed essentialized difference. As the depictions of fascists came to be translated from Yiddish to Russian, understandings of Jewish identity slid from one grounded in ethnicity to one that evoked ambivalently, if unmistakably, ascribed essential difference, which is to say, race. Such images could and likely were read in different directions depending on one's own subjectivity. For Jewish readers, such discourses threatened that those who continued to harbor secret sympathies for the anti-Stalinist opposition would be and could be and would be viewed as re-racialized enemies. For many non-Jewish viewers, such images likely reanimated suspicions that it was precisely the Jewish essence of oppositionists, however acculturated, that drove them into the enemy camp, simultaneously casting doubt about the fundamental assimilability of all Jews within the anti-fascist Soviet camp. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
Thank you. Very interesting images and paper. So where would you stand on the Yuri Slyozkin's thesis? It seems that he talks about the war bringing out this call of blood, both among Russians and Jews, it would seem. But you're arguing there was an essential difference between the way Jewish artists understood Nazism as opposed to Russians.
Yeah, I would say that I think that I don't know what I would make necessarily of Slozkin's argument on that point, but I would say that what I found to be interesting about this moment was it struck me as a surprising moment where there was this what I took to be a return to a type of representation that couldn't be understood through the tropes of ethnicity. And so in this moment, I think it prefigures the period of the war. I mean, this seems to be generated by the crisis itself. And in particular, I would argue, I mean, my first book ends in 29. I would argue that in some sense, we see prefigurations of this moment, and particularly, it's what I think is particularly interesting, it's in the anti-Trotskyist campaigns, even in the late 1920s, where you begin to see, I argue, this slide towards race in a discourse of race. So I don't know if that answers your question adequately, but.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the really fascinating talk and slides. I wanted to ask about your last point. One of the last points you made about Trotsky. I mean, what is Jewish about the political caricatures of Trotsky, Kamenev, if you have the rest of them, right? It seems, perhaps I'm wrong, but it seems that the anti-Nazi, the fascist term is being used to fight against these traditional enemies of the Soviet state, right? But the traditional Jewish practice, traditional Jews fall into a different category, right, than the political leaders, right? So they fall into the category of people who haven't made the transition, and they can still. The problem with the 1920s political figures, the Bolsheviks, seems to be significantly different and divorced from that problem of not having overcome one's Jewish essence. I mean, is your argument, I guess, then, how do we link what's the link here, and or are you arguing indeed that that they have, in a different way, not overcome some kind of Jewish essence.
Yeah, well, I think the link here is really the swastika. I mean, that's sort of the link. The link is the anti-fascist discourse itself. And so what I was interested in the way that this is changing, and what I found this to be a rather pronounced shift from this moment where you see these characters who are in some sense canonical tropes of anti-religious discourse, anti-Zionist discourse from the 1920s, re-emerging in this new guise, so to speak, in the moment, and then this transition to the anti-Trotskyist camp. And so that does raise, well, what's specifically Jewish about Trotsky? I mean, this is sort of the age-old question. And in this moment, I would say, really nothing. I mean, in some sense, all of these old vestiges of archaic Judaism have long been, in theory, cast off, right? He, at least, is self-consciously insistent on this point. And what I find to be curious is that it's particularly in this moment when you have here the canonical non-Jewish Jews who are suddenly politically problematic. How are they being, you can't accuse them of any of the deviations that are being attacked in those earlier images. And it's in this moment that in some sense it's the recourse to race, or it's the recourse to essential difference that becomes the driving, animating aspect of this campaign. So, what? Right. I mean, obviously, there's the deep paradox here that, in some sense, they're completely, well, not completely ignoring, but for the most part, ignoring the racial politics of Nazism itself, and insist through the insistence that fascism is fundamentally a social category, which opens the room, obviously, for all of the ambivalences in these images.
Я тоже воспользуюсь, задам вопрос. Все-таки вот с этим вот фашизмом, это была такая инфляция вот этого термина, что и его прикладывали ко всему, чему можно. Может, к мылу не прикладывали, да? Но, в принципе, прикладывали ко всему, скажем, der faschisierter Jüdischism. Там не было ничего расового, это просто надо было назвать это, все должно быть фашистским. Шоломаш получил орден польский, да? Вот ему там дали. Ицек Фефер пишет длинное стихотворение, что Шоломаш стал лакеем фашистским, что он лижет сапоги там Гитлеру, я уже не помню кому там, да, что там вот такое вот. И мне кажется, что это просто в то время вот этот вот фашистский фашизм прикладывалось абсолютно ко всему. И это делает проблемным эту интерпретацию в каком-то либо вот конкретном контексте. Это провокационный вопрос, естественно, да. И название провокационное.
It's a very interesting thing, dynamics, and it seems to me that if you look at the first picture where they have these three figures, the fascist looks more like Pilsudski than Hitler. And I think there is a shift between 1931, when fascism is actually like fascisierter Jüdischism, it's Jevo.
Right.
It's applied mostly to Poland, and then it turns into Germany. So I don't know if we can identify this moment and talk about a little bit about Poland as another sort of.
Yeah, even in the 1920s, I mean, in the newspapers in the 1920s, the discourse is consistently about fascist Poland, and that's the primary threat, particularly in the Belarusian newspapers, because that's the neighbor, right? And so, but even, I mean, at the same time, it's Mussolini who's the primary figure, and understood, in some sense, Pilsudski is seen as a variation of fascism a la Mussolini. And in those early images, I think what's critical is that the conspirators are seen as conspirators through social fascism. So what's really being critiqued here is social democracy and the non-Bolshevik left, right? And so in that sense, I think that there's also a transformation it becomes explicitly anti-Nazi, right? But so there is a slide in this respect, but yes, it's the Polish fascist threat that constitutes the primary threat in the late 1920s and early 1930s, most immediately, and then Hitler comes to power.
Я хочу только добавить, что интересно, мы сидим в комнате, где вот это полки стоят, да? Это библиотека нашего бывшего шефа. На самом деле нас трое здесь, да, для кого он был бывшим шефом, да, Арона Вергелиса, главного редактора журнала «Советский». Да? В 1972, по-моему, году вышел его роман «Цайт». Да? И там после войны в Вене встречаются 3 антисоветчика. Встречается сионист, который убежал через Биробиджан там, и китайскую границу, насколько я помню. Встречается власовец, они, по-моему, вместе там убегают, он кулакский сын, ну, такая реальная история. И они в Вене встречаются с бывшим этим известным нацистом Отто Скорцени, и вот они действуют, чтобы там антисоветские агитации, и распускают слухи о том, что в Биробиджане строятся бараки. Так что опять фашизм. Опять